In the last video I made, at the end I talked a little bit about the Epicureans and how their approach to understanding the world really left the door wide open for a non-physical reality to be part of the universe. And I wanted to delve a little deeper into that idea today because it's one that a lot of people have a knee-jerk negative reaction to, and I'm not going to prove anything with this. This is not here is an undisputable, you must believe this reason to believe in a non-physical reality. But I wanted to approach it in a way that makes it plausible. I forget which school of philosophy had the plausible account method of doing philosophy, but I think that the modernist reaction to the idea of the non-physical world is it's not as well founded as people like to think. And I'm gonna kind of take a page from Plato's book here a little bit. Aristotle recounts an anecdote about Plato that he said, listen, everybody, if you want to come and hear my lecture on the form of the good, you can come to the symposium or whatever lecture hall I'm using. I forget exactly what they called it. Doesn't matter to me for these cases. But come on down and I'm going to lecture to you on the form of the good. Now, Aristotle doesn't really believe in forms, so he's giving it to you, this idea, in kind of a mocking way. He's not really dismantling Plato here. He's just kind of saying this was a little bit silly. And the silly thing that Aristotle says that Plato did was he got everybody in this room and he lectured on the form of the good by telling them about mathematics. Now, this is partly because Plato is arguably within the tradition of what we would call the Pythagoreans. It's debatable whether or not the historical Pythagoras was this much into math and numbers, but if you use the word Pythagorean to refer to a philosophical school, you're talking about people who really, really get down with the numerology. And you might, again, think that, okay, numerology, that's not that big of a deal. What are we going to do? We're going to start with the one, which is the singularity, and then go to the two, which is multiplicity, and then you go to the three. No, the two is duality, the three is multiplicity. You can tell I'm not very good at it. But what I think that Plato's approach does more than anything is it really puts into focus the fact that there are things in the world that we use, that we interact with, that are non-physical. And the safest ones to talk about, right, the ones that will be the least likely to make people react in some negative way, are to talk about the numbers. Numbers exist in some sense. Now, it's arguable that numbers only exist in our heads. There is definitely a way of understanding numbers to say we invented them, we came up with them. They don't have any actual reality beyond just what is up inside the heads of humans. However, there are mathematicians, serious people who don't hold that view, who have used numbers and used mathematics so completely and so deeply that they come out the other side of mathematics saying, guys, this is real. The numbers are real somehow. I don't know how, but we didn't just make them up. They exist somewhere out there in the world. And the fact that perspective can exist at all is really the ground for this idea that I want to present of the non-physical, let's call it the world of thought. And here's the idea, and let's go back to the Epicureans now. The Epicureans said, okay, well, we're going to perceive things with our eyes and with our ears and with our touch, and those that we're going to accept that as real data about how the world works. All right, none of this thing in itself stuff. If you can look at something, you can tell something true about it. But they didn't stop with external sense data. They allowed you, I mean, almost required you in a sense, to use an internal compass as well. To say, oh, well, I'm feeling pain, I'm uncomfortable, I'm an Epicurean, so my goal is to avoid the state of pain, therefore I should avoid things that cause me pain. And it's not just physical pain. You can run from experiences that will make you uncomfortable, that would, you might eschew an entire life path that could take you into negative situations that you as an Epicurean would not want to be in. And none of that would involve people poking you with needles in your skin, but in some way your inner thought world can perceive that there are things that make you uncomfortable that are non-physical. And if we want to go a little further beyond the numbers, we can talk about pain, we can talk about love. People the word love is such a an ooey gooey word. It really makes people uncomfortable in certain circumstances, but I'm not trying to use that as sort of a I'm not trying to get anybody with that. I'm just saying, let's say that there's a tree behind me, right? Beautiful tree. All right. If you were here in the yard with me right now, you could go and you could look at this tree, and you could touch the tree, and you could lick the tree if you wanted to. I don't really recommend it, but that's an option for you. You could smell what the leaves smell like. You could hear the wind going in the branches. And your experience of the tree would not be identical to my experience of the tree. We would possibly stand from different points of view. We might see it being hit by different particles of light. I might lick a different part of the tree than you lick. And yet we could agree that such an object of the tree exists, even though our perception of it is not perfectly well aligned. And we might further go on to talk about the colors of the tree, and I would say the leaves are green, and you would say yes they are, and then we could have maybe our hippie moment of like, do I perceive colors the way that you perceive colors? Is my sense of green the same as your internal sense of green? And we would have that great, stoner revelation that everybody has. You don't have to be a stoner. I've never done any kind of drugs, but realizing that people could experience things that are internal to us differently, and yet we could still agree that the leaves are green. In the same sense that we can agree that the tree is real, that the leaves are green, that it has branches and a trunk, and we can agree that it is made out of material, we can also have experiences of non-physical things that we can agree on. All of us will have largely the same experience of love, of pain, of disappointment. I can speak to you of these things and you know what they are. It's not some foreign idea that like I have my internal thought world and it's completely different from your internal thought world. We might go to the color analogy and say, I might feel pain differently than you feel. My experience of joy might be different than yours somehow. Like, I can't know what's inside your head, and yet it is not unreasonable for me to say that I feel joy and expect you to know what that object in the thought world is. And it's not implausible to propose that joy is something like numbers that might exist outside of us, not outside of us in the physical world. All right, the number 378 is not floating around somewhere in outer space. When mathematicians say, if they hold this ideal view of numbers, they don't say, well, if we could just fly to Saturn, we would see the number 4. That's not what they're getting at. They're saying that there is another sense of existence in which the number 4 does exist in a non-physical way, and I can perceive it with my mind. And use the analogy of the eyes, right? We know how our eyes work. We understand that there are photons that come into the eyes, that strike the eyes and cause a chemical reaction that then triggers something in our brain that creates a sense of being able to see, of colors and a world that we create for ourselves. And what I'm proposing here, again, not proving, I don't know how you would prove this, is that in much the same way that we trust that our eyes show us something real about the world, right? We can't prove that we're not in some kind of simulation. We can't prove that we're not making up the things that we see, that we're not just hallucinating everything. There's that sort of sense that, well, maybe it's all a dream that we really can never get beyond, but we all act as if that's perfectly reasonable to accept. I don't go around, to the store and put the Snickers bar on the cashier's line and she looks at it and says, are we dreaming this? No, she just swipes it and I give her my money, which doesn't technically exist either because it's a digital thing now. And I get my Snickers bar and Walmart now has my money. And what I'm pointing out is that it's somewhat weird that we take the sense data we get from our external senses and we say, well, this tells us something about a real, existing, actual world. And then we take the data from within our heads and say, this tells me nothing about the real world. This is just in my head. Is the tree just in my eye? There's a sense where the tree is just in my eye. I mean, to speak of color again, I could argue that my eye creates the color. The color is not in the photon, right? Because there's all kind of different photons that can't interact with my eyes visually at all. If I turned off the lights in a room and I said, there's no light in here, you couldn't say, but the room is filled with microwaves, so there is light. That's not what we're talking about. There is a sense in which, yes, my eyes do make the light, and yet, again, I think it's perfectly reasonable for any person acting in the world to say, colors exist. They really exist. I didn't make them up. I participate in the pattern of recognizing those colors with the rest of humanity, but no person sat around and invented a color and the idea of color. Although even that's tricky. Don't look at the color blue and the history of the color blue and the fact that we didn't used to have it and now we do, and the sky isn't gray anymore, and it's still gray for some people. But I would argue that even that doesn't mean that the sky doesn't really have a color, and that the tree doesn't really exist. We interact with the tree. There is a sense in which we make it exist. There is a sense in which our brains separate the tree from the sky and from the ground, even though the tree participates with the sky and with the ground in very complex and difficult to discern ways. We can still say this is a tree and not feel foolish if we say there's really a tree. And I wonder why it is that as modern people, We can't say there is a feeling, there is a spirit that I sense, and not have the idea that it's real. We may not sense it exactly in the same way, but that doesn't mean, in the same sense that we don't experience the tree in exactly the same way, that doesn't mean the tree's not real. And you might argue back, Albert, but what about people who hallucinate things that are clearly not real? God's talking to them and they're running the International Space Station, and that's where the lizard people are. Okay, yes, it is possible for our senses to be distorted. I can wear glasses that make everything look red. I could be blind. I can rub my eyes really hard and see little points of light pop up into my vision and understand that those are not things that are real in the same sense that the tree is real. But showing that sometimes things go wrong in a sense organ does not preclude the possibility of getting anything truthful from that sense organ. If the eyes are the organ of the sense of sight, if the skin is the organ of sense of touch, what I'm proposing here is that maybe the mind, and possibly more particularly the brain, although I do not like that reductionist idea, is the sense organ for the world of thought. There's a lot of ways in which people used to have more nuance of how our bodies sense feelings and what we might call spiritual experiences. The scriptural idea of having your bowels moved, and not in a pooping way, right? And you can feel you can still talk about, I felt this in my gut. There's an idea that the kidneys are a source of a different type of feeling. So I don't like to localize it to the brain necessarily, because I think that's sort of a little bit of a modern reductionism. But to take it beyond the realm of physical sensation and say, yes, it is possible to learn something real from the internal world, I don't think that that's an implausible idea. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys for today. If you have a response, if you have an argument against this possibility, I've tried to think of a good one, and I'm not smart enough to. But if you have hey, listen, actually, here's why we can know things with our touch and our sight and our ears and stuff, but we can't know them with our intellect, our mind. We can't encounter anything real that's not physical. If you have a good, comeback for this, I'd love to hear it in the comments. So I appreciate your time and attention, and I'll see you next time with something else.